0. That is the number of times a Japanese fighter successfully intercepted the Sikorsky S-43 during its intelligence operations in the Pacific. Not once. Over months of missions that took the plane across stretches of ocean Japan believed it controlled without challenge, past islands the Imperial Navy considered secure, through the gaps in a defense network that had not yet learned what it needed to watch for. The Zero was faster. The Zero was armed. The Zero could have destroyed the S-43 without difficulty if it had ever reached it. The Zero never reached it. This is the story of why. We're going to tell you everything about this today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with what was actually in those files. And then we'll get into what it means. This was not supposed to reach the public. The intelligence program that used the Sikorsky S-43 in the Pacific before and during the early months of World War II was classified at a level that kept it out of the press and out of the official histories for years. The operational records describing where the plane went and what it found were held in archives that civilian researchers could not access until decades after the war. Here is what those records show. To understand why an unarmed amphibious flying boat could operate freely in contested Pacific airspace, you have to understand what the Pacific looked like in 1940 and 1941 from the perspective of the men who were trying to fight a war across it. The Pacific Ocean covers approximately 63 million square miles. In 1940, the relevant military infrastructure, the radar stations, the fighter bases, the patrol networks, covered a fraction of that area. Japan had been building out its island chain defenses since the 1930s, using the League of Nations mandate territories it had received after World War I as the foundation for a network of bases that stretched from the Mariana Islands through the Carolines and into the Marshalls. These bases were real. They had runways, fuel supplies, armed personnel, and fighter aircraft. What they did not have, in 1940 and for most of 1941, was the ability to watch more than a small portion of the ocean around them. A radar station can cover a specific arc at a specific range. An early 1940s radar station, with the technology available to Japan at that point, could see perhaps 100 to 150 miles under good conditions. Beyond that range, and in the vast spaces between the islands, there was nothing. Ships could be watched from shore or from aircraft on patrol. But patrol aircraft have ranges and fuel limits, and the Pacific between those bases was not empty of options for a plane that knew where the gaps were. The Sikorsky S-43 was not designed as a spy plane. It was designed as a commercial amphibian, a twin-engine flying boat that could carry passengers and cargo and land on water or on prepared runways, giving it a flexibility that dedicated land-based aircraft did not have. Pan American Airways operated similar Sikorsky aircraft on the trans-Pacific routes it had been developing since 1935, and the military and intelligence communities that paid attention to these routes understood something that the commercial operators made possible. A plane that could land on any calm body of water and take off again did not need airfields. It did not need the logistical infrastructure that tied conventional aircraft to specific known locations. It could go places where there was no runway, and it could leave from places where there was no runway. And the men on the shore who might have reported its presence had no facility to call that could do anything about it in time. The U.S. Navy operated several S-43s under the designation JRS-1. These were not modified from their commercial specification in ways that were visible from the outside. They looked like what they were, flying boats, large and lumbering, moving at the modest cruise speed that the S-43 was designed for, which was approximately 160 miles per hour. Nothing about them suggested a threat. Nothing about them suggested that the men inside were doing anything other than crossing the ocean on whatever business brought amphibious aircraft across the ocean. This was precisely the point. Before getting to the plane itself, it helps to understand what the Americans were trying to see and why they could not see it through conventional means. Under Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant and the subsequent Pacific Islands Mandate, Japan had been granted administrative control over former German territories in the Pacific following World War I. Specifically, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands, excluding Guam. The mandate came with conditions. The islands were to be administered for the benefit of their populations. No military fortifications were to be constructed. No naval bases were to be built. The islands were not to be used for strategic purposes. Japan accepted these conditions in 1920, and then, over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, proceeded to ignore them. The fortification of the mandated territories was not conducted openly. Japanese civilian ships serviced the islands on routes that passed through American-controlled Guam and other points, maintaining the appearance of routine commercial traffic. Foreign visitors to the mandated islands were restricted, then excluded, then prohibited entirely. The League of Nations monitoring apparatus, which was never robust to begin with, had no mechanism to compel inspection. American diplomats who pressed for clarification about what was happening in the Marshalls and Carolines received official assurances that nothing was happening. Naval intelligence analysts who looked at shipping traffic and estimated construction supply volumes concluded that something was happening. They needed photographs. The intelligence problem in the Pacific in 1940 and 1941 was specific and urgent. Japan had been fortifying its mandated island territories in ways that violated the terms of the League of Nations mandate, which prohibited military construction. The United States suspected this. Naval intelligence needed to know the extent of the construction, which islands had runways, which had fuel depots, which had harbor facilities capable of supporting fleet operations. This was not information that could be obtained from maps or from shipping manifests. It required eyes over the territory. And the territory was Japanese, and flying military reconnaissance aircraft over Japanese territory in 1940 was not something the diplomatic situation permitted. The S-43 was a solution to a problem that could not be solved by conventional means. If you think this story deserves to be heard, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these stories to the people who need to hear them. The routes that the S-43 flew during its Pacific intelligence operations took it along the edges and through the gaps of the Japanese island defense network. The plane's range, approximately 775 miles on a standard fuel load, extendable with additional tanks, was sufficient to reach areas that were technically within the Japanese sphere, but practically beyond the response time of Japanese fighters based on any island within range. The calculation was not about outrunning the Zero. It was about the time required for a Japanese radar station or patrol vessel to detect the aircraft, report it, have the report processed, get a fighter on alert, get that fighter airborne, and direct it toward an intercept point. Against that timeline, a plane moving at 160 miles per hour over open ocean, already past the target area before any alert could be transmitted, could be functionally invisible. The S-43 also had an advantage that no document ever formally acknowledged, but that every pilot who flew the missions understood. It looked like a commercial aircraft. The Pacific in 1940 and 1941 still had civilian traffic. Pan American clippers crossed the ocean on schedule. Japanese patrol aircraft that spotted a flying boat at altitude over a stretch of Pacific had a decision to make. Was this a military aircraft conducting reconnaissance, or was this a commercial operator on a legitimate route? In 1940, before Pearl Harbor, the answer was not obvious. And taking hostile action against what might be a civilian aircraft belonging to a country with which Japan was not at war was a decision that required authorization that took time. Time was what the S-43 needed. The crews who flew the missions were selected for specific qualities that had nothing to do with combat experience. What the program needed were pilots who could navigate long distances over open ocean without landmarks, who could hold altitude and heading for hours without losing position, and who understood that the discipline the missions required was the discipline of patience rather than aggression. The observers, the men in the back of the plane with the cameras and the notebooks, were naval intelligence officers who had been briefed on what to look for and how to record what they found. They counted runways and estimated their length. They noted dock facilities and estimated their capacity. They photographed fuel tanks and radio masts and the specific shapes of revetments and gun emplacements. They did this from altitude, through the windows of a plane that was moving at cruise speed and could not slow down, and they did it without being able to circle or overfly a second time if the first pass had not been clean. The training for this kind of observation was specific. An observer who had never done it before would miss things that an experienced observer caught automatically. The shadow pattern that indicated a covered structure, the discoloration of the water that suggested harbor dredging, the vegetation clearance pattern that preceded runway construction. The men the program used were experienced. They had been learning the Pacific from the air for years, and what they had learned was how to see it, rather than just look at it. The missions produced results. Naval intelligence analysts who processed the photography and crew reports from these operations were able to build a picture of Japanese military construction in the mandated territories that was significantly more detailed than anything available from other sources. The runways at specific islands, the harbor depths, the fuel storage, the tactical picture that American planners had when they began designing Pacific operations after December 7, 1941, was built in part on what those flights had found. The men who flew them were not celebrated. They were, for years, barely acknowledged. The classification that protected the program while it was running remained in place long after the program ended, because releasing the details would have revealed the methods, and the methods were still considered sensitive. The question of when and how Japan became aware of American photographic reconnaissance in the mandated territories before Pearl Harbor is one that the post-war records do not resolve cleanly. The Japanese military's record-keeping on this specific subject was inconsistent, and many of the relevant documents from the Naval Intelligence Command were destroyed in the final weeks of the war or lost in the occupation. What can be reconstructed comes from interrogation transcripts, from American signals intelligence records that captured some of the Japanese internal communications, and from the post-war testimony of Japanese officers who survived. The picture that emerges is of a Japanese command that suspected something was occurring but could not confirm it with the specificity required to take action. Suspicion without confirmation is not the same as knowledge. The command knew that American intelligence was actively interested in the mandated territories. It took countermeasures, increasing the frequency of patrols, restricting civilian traffic near sensitive installations, requiring island garrisons to log and report all aircraft sightings regardless of type. These measures produced more reports. They did not produce intercepts. The S-43 was not in the reports because the S-43 did not look like a military reconnaissance aircraft to the men who saw it, if they saw it at all. The Japanese side of this story took longer to come together and required access to Japanese military records that were not available to Western researchers until the post-war occupation opened the archives. What those records show is that Japanese signals intelligence and Naval Air Command were aware, in general terms, that American reconnaissance activity was occurring in the mandated territories. They intercepted radio traffic. They received reports from island garrisons that aircraft had been spotted. What they could not do was correlate those reports into a coherent picture of what was happening, because the plane that was doing it left no systematic trail and followed no regular route that could be predicted and intercepted. There is an account in the post-war interrogation files of a Japanese naval air officer who had been responsible for patrol operations in the Central Pacific in 1941. When asked about American reconnaissance during that period, he said that the command had received reports of unidentified aircraft sightings over several of the mandated islands on dates that could not be correlated with any known American military flight schedule. He said the reports were treated as uncertain, possibly commercial aircraft off course, possibly equipment malfunction, possibly observer error. He said the command had concluded, at the time, that American photographic reconnaissance of the mandated territories was not occurring at any significant level because no systematic American air presence had been established in the Central Pacific. He said, in the context of a 1946 interrogation, that this conclusion had been wrong. The intelligence picture built from these missions influenced planning at the highest levels of American Pacific strategy. When Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff began designing the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach the Japanese home islands, the foundational maps they worked from, the ones that described which islands had which facilities, which could support air operations, which were worth taking and which could be bypassed, were built in part on information gathered before the war by aircraft whose existence was not acknowledged in the planning documents. The pilots and observers who flew those missions were not in the briefing rooms where the decisions were made. Their contribution was in the charts, in the target folders, in the specific annotations about harbor depth and runway orientation that allowed planners to calculate what each island would require to take and what it would provide once taken. This kind of contribution is difficult to commemorate. There is no discrete moment to point to, no battle, no intercept, no rescue. There is only the photograph that was taken and the analysis that followed and the decision that was better informed because of it. The men who made those photographs possible flew their missions, returned their aircraft, submitted their reports, and went on to the next mission. The classification that surrounded the program meant that the connection between their work and the decisions it supported was never drawn publicly. It was drawn in the archives, eventually, by the historians who read the files and traced the influence backward. The S-43 operated in the Pacific through the early months of American involvement in the war, before the pace of combat operations and the availability of dedicated military reconnaissance aircraft made its particular combination of capabilities less necessary. By 1942, the Navy had access to longer-range patrol aircraft and to bases from which conventional reconnaissance could be conducted. The S-43's specific utility, the amphibious flexibility, the civilian appearance, the operation in the pre-radar gaps of a defense network not yet at war, was a product of a specific moment that the moment then passed. The pilots who flew those missions aged into obscurity in the way that men whose work was classified tend to age. Some of them talked about it after the records were released. Most of them did not talk about it much even then, because the habit of not discussing it was 40 years old by the time discussion became permitted. The full operational history of the S-43 intelligence program, the specific missions, the specific targets, the specific dates, has been reconstructed from declassified naval intelligence files, post-war interrogations of Japanese officers, and the accounts that some of the surviving crew members gave in the 1970s and 1980s, when military historians finally started asking about the period before December 7th, with the same detail they had always applied to the period after it. What those accounts describe is a program that worked because it understood something the Japanese defense network had not yet learned to account for. The network was designed to watch for threats. The S-43 was not a threat. It carried cameras and observers and the specific kind of patience required by men who understood that their job was to pass through unnoticed and report what they had seen. No guns, no bombs, no aggressive maneuver. Just the plane and the ocean and the long, slow passage through the gap between one island and the next. The Japanese Naval Air Command understood, after the fact, that something had been happening in the airspace above its mandated territories that it had not detected and could not retrospectively reconstruct. The post-war interrogations produced officers who were willing to acknowledge, in the context of a defeated military establishment, that American pre-war reconnaissance had been more extensive and more effective than the defense network had identified. What they could not tell their interrogators was specifically how it had been done, because the program had left no signature they could identify. The plane had come and gone without announcement. The intelligence it carried had shaped a war their military had lost, and the aircraft that had carried it was a commercial amphibian that any traffic controller in 1940 would have logged as routine. The Zero could have caught it. If a Zero had been in the right place at the right time with enough fuel and a clear vector, it could have caught the S-43 in approximately the time it would have taken the S-43 to accelerate to its maximum speed. The Zero was never in the right place. Not once, across the full run of operations, was a Japanese fighter able to put itself between the S-43 and whatever it was going home to report. The defense network was built for a different kind of enemy. The S-43 was not that kind of enemy. It was something the network did not have a category for, an unarmed, slow, unremarkable aircraft that was already gone before anyone understood it had been there. There is something in the operational logic of the S-43 program that goes beyond the specific war it served. The problem it solved, how to gather information from territory that your enemy controls and your diplomats cannot access, is a problem that did not end with the Pacific War. The methods the program developed, the civilian cover, the use of amphibious capability to eliminate dependency on fixed bases, the exploitation of gaps in a defense network designed for a different kind of threat. These methods informed the thinking of the intelligence community that emerged from the war and built the apparatus of Cold War reconnaissance. The men who designed the U-2 program in the 1950s, who built the satellite reconnaissance systems that followed it, were working from a conceptual foundation that programs like the S-43 missions had established. You do not need to be faster than the enemy's fighters. You need to be in a place where the enemy's fighters are not. They remember the cockpit at altitude over open ocean, the specific flat blue of the Pacific in every direction, the absence of anything to navigate by except the instruments and the charts, and the knowledge of where the next Japanese island was and how far its fighters could reach. They remember the silence of the approach, the slow banking turn over the target area, the observer in the back of the plane doing what observers do, watching, counting, recording. They remember the long flight home over water that looked exactly the same as the water they had flown over going out, and the particular relief of it, and the debriefing that waited on the other side. Now you know what was in the file. Did your grandfather serve in the Pacific? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.